Hello everyone, thank you for joining our webinar on Seneca's perspective of time and shortness of life, hosted by the Aurelius Foundation. Please type and submit your questions via the Q&A or the chat functions on your Zoom toolbar at any time over the next hour. We won't be using the raise hand function today. Please leave any feedback from today's webinar via our social channels, which are Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, or feel free to email us at info@aureliusfoundation.com. I hope you enjoy today's discussion, and now I will hand over to Justin, founder of the foundation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Holly. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon, as all of us are still working through, in many different parts of the world, the COVID-19 lockdown. And as the world starts to come alive, or tries to start to come alive, it's very interesting to see different perspectives of people. I know the interactions that I'm having, and people are taking a different view about the go-forward working engagement, the go-forward family arrangements, the go-forward travel arrangements. And I think COVID, for all its negativity and all its dislocation and disruption, it has provided an opportunity for many people to think again, to rethink, to recalibrate, and think about their purpose, think about time, the value of time, how they spend their time, and those interactions together. So I'm very fortunate again to have Dr. John Sellars with us this afternoon, a co-founder of the foundation with me, along with Pat Cash, Joe Easton, and Guy Hume, my wife Natalia, and Holly. So just a couple of things around the foundation. We've got in the next couple of months some fundraising events, which we will send out to, and some engagement events that we will send out to members of the foundation. We'll keep you posted on that. I'm very pleased that John is with me again, as always. John is soon to take over as the chair of the organization around modern Stoicism. So I did want to mention that in October, there will be the Modern Stoic Week again. It'll be targeted around the 19th of October. So the foundation will be looking to support modern Stoicism under John's chairmanship, the whole team around him, and that week. So we've also been invited to be in the United States at a number of university campuses in the next periods, but that will have to wait until the COVID lockdown gets to a next phase. But as those events and those global opportunities come to fruition, we will certainly notify everyone. So on that note, we decided to talk about Seneca. I was mentioned to John not too long ago that I start my day with Aurelius and I end my day with Seneca. And based on the COVID lockdown, and as mentioned, I think a lot of people have been thinking about time. They've been thinking about their life and maybe recalibrating and thinking about the value of time, how they spend it, but also then that translates into how I spend my time and where I'd like to allocate my time to the things that I believe to be important. So we find that Seneca addresses all of these bigger, larger, and important philosophical questions in what I call a very pragmatic way. But we'll talk more about that in a moment. So we thought we'd start off today with, and I'm going to hand over to John in a moment, just to talk about Seneca's life, who he was, some of the facts around him, and his impact and stature within Stoicism. He is certainly one of the better known names, one of the giants within the Stoic field. But I find him very pragmatic, and I will talk about that in a moment. So welcome this afternoon, John, and we open up with John to just talk more about the facts around Seneca and his life and the things that he did, the things that he achieved in some of his roles. So welcome again this afternoon, John.
Oh, thanks for having me. So yeah, let me say a bit about Seneca, a bit about who he was. So Seneca's originally from Spain, from a very high-ranking family. His father was a famous rhetorician, and his brothers went on to hold high office as well. So he came from a fairly privileged background. He was taken to Rome when he was a child, and he was educated there, and very quickly embroiled in the imperial court. So over the course of his life, he has run-ins with a number of different emperors, with Caligula, with Claudius, and then much later with Nero. And anyone who knows anything about Roman history will know that these were some of the most dangerous and unstable individuals ever to have been in charge of anything. So he was really in the thick of it. At one point, I think he was probably around the age of 40, he's accused of adultery, and he's sent into exile. This may well have been a false charge, that it may well have been politically motivated, and there was simply a desire to get him out of the picture. And if I remember rightly, there was even talk of having him executed, but he suffered from a number of health complaints, and he was so sickly that the emperor thought, well, it's not worth executing him. He'll probably die anyway. We'll send him into exile. So he suffered. He had some health problems he was dealing with throughout his life, which was just one of a number of different types of adversity he was dealing with. Going into exile was another. He's sent to Corsica, and he spends 8 years on the island of Corsica. So almost a decade, basically the decade of his 40s, more or less, spent stuck there. And it's while he's there that he writes a number of his philosophical works. So a number of his essays are written during that period, including some letters of consolation that he sent to various people, including to his mother, trying to comfort her at the loss of her son from public life. He's eventually called back out of exile, again at a very high level, in order and on the condition that he is tutor to the young Nero, who at this point is very young. No one knows what he's going to turn into. So he accepts that job, goes back into the imperial court, and benefits again from imperial favor. And as Nero grows up and becomes emperor, Seneca kind of graduates from being his tutor to his sort of official advisor, and works alongside Nero for basically the decade of his 50s, right? So his 40s are spent in exile in Corsica, his 50s are spent working alongside Nero. And then around the time he gets to the age of 60, when Nero is that much older and evidently unstable, whilst being the most powerful person in the Western world, Seneca seeks to extricate himself from this very difficult position that he's found himself in. He's kind of got a job that you can't resign from, right? So he hopes to retire from public life. I think he does to an extent, but I think he upsets Nero in the process, and Nero doesn't forget this. And a few years later, Nero accuses Seneca of being involved in a plot against him. By this point, Nero's quite paranoid and insecure. Whether Seneca was involved in any such plot or not, I don't know. One could imagine Seneca having very good reasons for wanting to see Nero out of power. We don't know for sure. It could have, again, just been trumped up charges. And Seneca is effectively forced to commit suicide at the very end of his life. Again, one of those impossible situations, you know, either you kill yourself or we'll kill you and all of your immediate family. So Seneca decides to kill himself, and he stages his death very much modeled on the death of Socrates as a kind of sort of noble, heroic suicide right at the end of his life. So it's a really tumultuous life. I mean, he deals with illness along the way. He deals with bereavement, as everyone does, and he deals with these incredible highs and lows of being one of the most powerful people in the inner circle of the imperial court to being completely thrown out and threatened with execution. So he really knew what good fortune and bad fortune and adversity were all about, because he lived through it in a way that most of us couldn't even imagine.
Yeah. It's an excellent summary. And recently, there's a lot of understandings and learnings just from that overview about his life and how he dealt with these ups and downs and these tumultuous periods, and clearly dealing with the emperors that he had to deal with, particularly Caligula and Nero, were very, very difficult situations with emotional volatility around him, combined with extreme power, must have been so precarious on a daily basis. But what's interesting is what you said there, John. I found when he was at different points out his life sidelined. He was in the heart of the action, and then he was put out to pasture. And then he was brought back into the heart of the action, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that that's a good learning and understanding for, in my business world, and looking at some of my peers and looking at other careers that are with friends and so forth. Your career is like that. It really is. And anyone expects their career to be one continual moving forward of positivity. It just doesn't work like that. And I think COVID's been a lesson, and the lockdown and disruption has taken on for different types of reasons for different types of people. But for the youth that are coming through and trying to come out of university and trying to start their life, you could look to Seneca's examples of being in and out of the game, but always one way or another, he kind of gets back into his career or into a position of relevance or into a momentum going forward, even when in the height of his career, in the peak of his powers, possibly in his 40s, he was sidelined. And the next minute in his 50s, he's back in court and he's really in the middle, in the heart of the Roman leadership and that theatre again. I think that's a powerful lesson to take on his life and how he dealt with things. Next, we've got the letters. And these, John, I'd love you to talk to them. And I find these letters pretty remarkable. And I think some of again, starting with the conversation around Aurelius and his audience, and I'll let you talk to that in a moment as well, John. And then you have Seneca talking to his audience. And the first impressions could be a little bit misconstrued of what and who Seneca is actually talking to. Clearly, Aurelius is a diary, but then Seneca in these letters and his other bodies of work is very interesting. But these letters to Lucilius, I'd love you to mention, John, the fact of what we know about them and the potential body of work that has been lost. And then we can talk about the coverage of the topics in these letters. So, John, would you reference it and your perspectives on these letters and the body of work itself?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the first thing to say is, or the first thing to reflect on is who was Lucilius? And the short answer to that is, we don't know that much about him. We don't have much external evidence. So all we really know about who this person was are bits and pieces of information we can glean from the letters themselves. And I know my first impression on reading the letters was that Lucilius was someone junior. He was someone much younger than Seneca, that Seneca was giving advice to. So Seneca's the elder, worldly man. I say writing these letters probably about, probably in his early 60s, should we say, that kind of age. So he's got a lifetime of experience. And as we've just been saying, it was a real life that he'd lived. So he had lots of experience to draw on. And he's offering this advice to someone more junior than him. That was my first impression, at least. But it looks as if that can't be the case. I mean, from the bits of information we have, it looks as if Lucilius was probably about Seneca's age. I mean, he'd lived through many of the things that Seneca had experienced. He was a government official, so someone mid-ranking in the Roman Empire. I think based in Sicily, maybe a tax collector or something like that. But obviously an old friend of Seneca's. So you've got this weird relationship where, on the one hand, they're roughly contemporaries. This is two old friends talking to each other. On the other hand, there looks like there's a real kind of power dynamic of a teacher and a pupil. So one can imagine that Lucilius is someone who perhaps isn't that well versed in philosophy at all. And so in the context of the discussions they're having, he's the junior partner who Seneca is educating, but he's educating him as a friend, not as a much younger individual. Mm-hmm. And the letters we've got, I mean, we've got a lot of letters, and Justin, as you said to me previously, it looks as if they cover almost every possible topic you could imagine. All sorts of different practical topics are addressed in these letters. But we do know that this isn't all of the correspondence. So the letters we've got in the medieval manuscript tradition, they're divided into two different books. Two different codices effectively would have contained the first half of the letters and the second half. And we have references from antiquity to books of letters that don't survive. So the assumption is that there could well have been a third medieval manuscript full of further letters that got lost along the way. So this isn't all the correspondence. It's possibly, say, 2/3, but obviously we don't know for sure. So this would have been an ongoing correspondence. There's been some discussion about whether it was artificial or real. Are these letters that were just written, miniature essays, if you like, written and presented as if they're essays, or whether it was a genuine correspondence of letters back and forth? I mean, I'm inclined to think it was a genuine correspondence, and there are odd references in the letters where it looks as if Seneca is responding to replies he's had from Lucilius. And obviously we don't have those replies, so we don't know what they say. But again, I think another thing people tend to think is that it was very much a one-sided correspondence, right? So this is Seneca giving lots of information to Lucilius, and Lucilius's replies might have been fairly brief, a sort of, thank you very much, that was very interesting, do you have anything to say about this topic? So I think Seneca was really the driving force in the correspondence, and in part it's just him getting stuff off his chest, sharing things that he's found intellectually interesting, and in other cases he's giving really focused practical advice. And it may well be that those were prompted by Lucilius, and problems that Lucilius might have been dealing with in his own life.
Yeah, I think you touched on there, John, very, very acutely. When I read these letters, I find it covers almost the entire range of the human condition. Every single aspiration, disappointment, managing through your own emotions, the progress of the stages of life, facing all sorts of different challenges and circumstances. It's a huge body of work, and the logic behind it is very consistent, I find. It is very consistent, and we'll talk about purpose in a moment. But whether you're looking at, I'm looking at letter 83 here on drunkenness, if I'm looking at letter 49, which is one of my favorites, on the shortness of life, on choosing teachers, on mentorship, and there's fantastic letters when he would go on vacation and he would be observing contemporaries' villas and what he thought about those villas and the people who owned them, and how he broke them down into the fundamental comparisons back to Stoic self-control or excess and so forth. So it's a huge body of work, and I do find it very interesting that, as you've shared with us, that there could have been another third of missing letters, if you will, and that would have been fascinating to have read. So these letters are really interesting to me. They are very poignant in their message, and we'll talk about some of the themes that come out consistently as far as I can continually take on board. And on that basis, the first piece is really talking about on the purpose and guidance for life. And these are some of the quotes that over the last periods that I've continually taken down and reference how Seneca, from his perspective, is talking about the purpose and what a man and person, a woman, it should be focusing on, no matter what their station in life. If they were an emperor, or an advisor, a tax collector, a business person, whatever, he rises above and continually challenges that individual that the purpose of life is to live a philosophical life, a life looking for honorable behavior, for noble pursuits and development of character and behavior on a consistent basis, irregardless of your station and what you're doing. And the second thing that comes from that life, he often references that progression in a person being tranquil, calm, collected, no matter what the situation that is before that person, that the person remains in that reassuring manner. And I think it comes back to some of your points you mentioned before, John. This guy having to deal with Caligula, deal with Nero, Claudius to a degree, in that environment, he would have had to have an internal environment himself, you would think, to be relatively calm, because the volatility around him could have been extreme. So, John, your take on what his continual guidance is around purpose for people?
Yeah, sure. So as you say, I mean, this idea of tranquility, calmness, the ultimate goal of living a good, happy life comes through really strongly. And I think the emphasis on tranquility is really striking in particular. So one of the much longer essays that Seneca writes, it deals with anger and problems of anger. And Seneca's seen close up how destructive and dangerous anger can be, dealing with some of these emperors. And so tranquility for him, mental tranquility, is the opposite of the angry person who's out of control, violent, destructive, a danger to the people that are around them. And you could think that Seneca seems quite self-absorbed or self-obsessed if he's just thinking about his inner tranquility, his calmness, his happiness. You might think that's a bit self-absorbed, but I think it's worth stressing that what he sees closely connected to developing that inner state of tranquility is avoiding all of those antisocial emotions, right? So you avoid the anger and the jealousy and the hatred and the bitterness. You avoid all of those things. So in the process, not only do you benefit by enjoying this inner calm and tranquility, but you also automatically benefit all of those people around you because you've taken all of those negative emotions out of the equation. So I think there's a sense in which getting those personal benefits and becoming a better ethical person, a better social being, those go hand in hand, I think. And that's something that comes through once you dig a bit deeper, right? So we start by paying attention to ourselves and sorting our own lives out, and realizing that by generating that calm mental state for ourselves so that we can navigate all of those ups and downs of life that are out of our control, we're also going to become better human beings. So everyone benefits as well. So there's no tension. I mean, so in modern ethics, it's often thought that there's a tension between people acting in their self-interest and people acting for the sake of others. And I think what's interesting about Stoicism more widely, but particularly what Seneca talks about, how best to live, there's no conflict between the two. If we do what's best for us, which is developing that tranquil frame of mind, everyone else benefits as well. And there's no conflict of interest there. I think that's a really interesting lesson that we can learn from Seneca.
Yeah. I think this last quote here, you know, I put two pages of quotes down here. They're all very powerful in developing a philosophical way of life, maintaining that. And I liked your context there, John, about the fact that if you get your own act together and you're developing that on a consistent basis, and the inner wellness is there, the inner calm is there, the tranquility is developed, and that gives you the opportunity to work through your life in the circumstances that you're in, and that will emanate out into the world and to others. And he uses Stoicism. That's his model. And I think this last quote summarizes it very well. But no, and I'll just read it here efficiently. No man can live a happy life or even a supportable life without the study of wisdom. Let's say, for example, Stoicism. And philosophy molds and constructs our soul. It orders our life, guides our conduct, and shows us what we should do and what we should leave undone. It sits at the helm and directs our course as we waver amid uncertainties. Without it, no one can live fearlessly or in a peace of mind. Countless things happen every hour that call for advice, and such advice is to be sought in philosophy. What I love about this quote is that it's actually telling you there in black and white how to find your purpose, at least from his perspective. He's telling us right there that a philosophical life will mold and construct our frameworks. He says soul. It can order ourselves. It can guide us. And I think that sometimes, John, I'd love to get your perspective on this. When I guess from a business perspective, again, I find Aurelius chairman-like and CEO-like. I find Seneca very chief operating officer. I find he's the guy that's, you know, he's navigating through these things within himself to create an environment, and he's offering real practical advice. And I think sometimes, as you've referenced, even today, that Aurelius is a diary that we observe, that he's obviously, it's an inner diary, it's a personal thing. Here, when you see these types of quotes, and even the one above it, you know, he's really giving you tangible stuff, like an operator. You know, he's really sharing that. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think so. And the difference between Marcus and Seneca here is Marcus is, of course, talking to himself. He's offering guidance to himself. The meditations are written to himself. Seneca's writing for other people. He's writing letters to other people. He's writing essays addressed to other people. So he's offering practical advice, not just talking to himself. And again, Marcus Aurelius is, if you like, at the top of the food chain. So he's talking to himself and potentially offering advice to people beneath him, but he's got no one above him telling him what to do. Seneca's stuck in the middle, right? So he's going to have people above him and people below him, and he's going to be navigating those different relationships. And I remember a very eminent academic once saying to me that he thought Seneca was the perfect reading for the middle-aged middle manager, precisely because he was occupying that role and dealing with all those different conflicting demands on him. And in that sense, I think it can come across as much more practical and much more pragmatic.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I just wanted to go back to the slide that we were on just a moment ago and the quote that you read out. The quote just above also, I think it deserves a quick bit of comment. Riches have shut off many a man from the attainment of wisdom. Poverty is unburdened and free from care. I mean, this is a point on which Seneca has sometimes been criticized. So, as I said, he came from a very high-ranking family. He moved in these very powerful circles, and he, as an individual, was also very, very wealthy. And so when Seneca talks about the kind of the benefits of poverty and the freedom of poverty, some people have been very, very cynical or have been very critical of those sorts of remarks. You know, what did Seneca ever know about poverty? He was one of the wealthiest people that the Roman Empire knew. And that may be true to a point, although, as we've already said, he certainly suffered his fair share of adversity. But I think it's the other side of the equation that's interesting. One thing that Seneca really does know from first-hand experience is that great wealth and great power and influence don't on their own guarantee a good, happy life. And he knows that because he's benefited from them, and he's seen that they can bring benefits, but they can also bring a lot of serious challenges as well. So he knows all too well, in the way in which most ordinary people don't, that being fabulously wealthy and being influential isn't all that people might think it's cracked up to be. That's not the answer to a good, happy life. Yeah. It's gaining that mental tranquility. It's seeking that advice in philosophy that you mentioned. That's going to be the key.
I think it's a great, you know, to me, Stoicism and philosophy isn't about reading these types of texts or these types of influences and then putting it back on the shelf. Philosophy, and I love the Stoic way of life because it's meant to be exactly that, a way of life. And your references right there, John, about, you know, success and wealth and material gain and fame and fortune, all that, it's perceived to be something that a lot of people or society craves and society suggests that we go after. But you only have to look at the current events of today. You know, the court case at the moment of Johnny Depp and Amber Heard in the London courts today. You can see two very unsettled individuals, is what I would say. It's not for me to know what their life is, but you can see that they've achieved so much in certain ways, but the events play out differently. And I think that is, the other side of the coin, as you mentioned, that Seneca is firsthand was observing extreme wealth, extreme power, extreme fame, all those things. And he wasn't necessarily anything remotely close to calm, collected, happy individuals. And I think that's an excellent call out. One thing I wanted to draw your attention to on this previous page as well, is the second quote, John, that a wise man is joyful, happy, calm, unshaken, and he lives on a plane with the gods. Once again, it's interesting to me that he continually references tranquility and the development thereof. And we're always in a society that is so busy, is so pursuing career advancement and trying to get ahead. And within that, the ability for an individual to remain calm and tranquil is a challenge. Whether it's through, and I'm always advocating to my management teams and people that work around me, a well-balanced experience. How do you create that? Seneca spends a lot of time on tranquility, a lot of time on calmness, a lot of time on developing that. Whether he was a meditation advocate or not in those times, who knows? But he does spend a lot of time on tranquility and developing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And self-examination as well. So there's a very famous passage in his book on anger where he talks about taking himself to one side in the evening and reflecting on his experiences of the day, how he could have done better, what he did well, what lessons he might learn from the day, and how he might do better the next day. Those kind of regular practices of self-examination, which he thinks are fundamental to any kind of ethical development. And those are practices that come from, well, ultimately from the sort of Pythagorean tradition of thinking. So the quote just above there on that same slide starts with Sextius. Sextius ran a school of philosophy in Rome, and Seneca studied with Sextius. And Sextius was influenced by Stoic ideas, but also by Pythagorean ideas, which often had those sorts of practices of self-development and meditation. And just as an aside, Pythagoras, we tend to think of him as a Greek philosopher, but he was located in southern Italy. So I think the Romans were inclined to think of Pythagoras as one of their own, right? He was on Italian soil. So they thought of him as one of their forebears. So they were quite happy to draw on those practices and make use of them. And Seneca certainly does that.
Yeah. And I think that point is supported by the third quote here, where he's talking to Lucilius here, and he says, I try to extract and render useful some element from every field of thought, no matter how far removed it may be from philosophy. So you mentioned there his self-critiquing on a consistent basis, but he was obviously very curious. He had a very curious mind, and curiosity was something that he obviously pursued and also helped formulate his expansion of thoughts. So he was clearly a very intelligent individual, but he was also a very curious individual. And he was walking this purpose every day of living a philosophical life in the heat of the action or when he was not.
Yeah, and it's perhaps worth reflecting on what he means by philosophy here. So on the one hand, in a slightly narrower sense of the term, he means philosophy in the way in which we would think about it. He's thinking about Stoicism and the basic principles of ethical guidance that Stoicism offers. But in a wider sense, by philosophy, he means intellectual inquiry and reflection in a much wider sense. So he writes a book called The Natural Questions, which looks at all sorts of issues in the natural sciences, dealing with meteorology and certain other issues like that. So he was interested in studying the natural world. Obviously, there's no real hard distinction between philosophy and science at this period in history. So he does that kind of reflecting, but also he recommends the reading of literature and history. There are moral lessons that we can learn from reading literature and history. We can benefit from those. He thinks that these are the sorts of things that are worthwhile leisure pursuits. And I mean, our modern idea of something like the liberal arts, for instance, right? The arts subjects that people take, that people pursue in their leisure. Things like, English, history, philosophy, all of these subjects. He thinks these are worthwhile pursuits and the sorts of things we ought to be spending our spare time on. So we can learn from all of these things. So it's not necessarily philosophy in a very narrow disciplinary sense. It's intellectual inquiry in a very broad and open-ended way.
Very good. The next theme, we've got two more to cover. We're talking about purpose and guidance. On time. He spends a lot of time, excuse the pun, referencing and cultivating the idea of purpose. And if you have your purpose right, then you should be utilizing your time better. And I put these two quotes together for a couple of reasons. One, the first one, because it's an excellent one. I will read it. My time is free, it is indeed free, and whenever I am the master of myself. For I do not surrender my affairs, I do not surrender to my affairs, but loan myself to them. And I do not hunt out excuses for wasting my time. So I think that the piece is there that he is in command of his mind, or he's endeavoring to be in command of his mind and where he's placing his time and how he owns it, whether he's in his truly free time or whether he's applying his talents or in his day-to-day activities for something else. And the second quote here, I think, is hugely interesting when he talks referencing everything about the past. Whether it's 5 minutes ago or 30 years ago, it's all in one bucket. It is essentially 1 second ago, and it's put into one bucket. And I put the last quote here, last part of this quote: all past time is in the same place. It all represents or presents the same aspect to us. It lies together. Everything slips into the same abyss. And I think that's a remarkable quote of understanding when you think about it, whether it's 5 minutes ago or 30 years ago, whatever's happening, it's in that bucket. And somewhat irrelevant at that point, hopefully you've taken lessons. John, your perspective on both of those, but particularly the second one.
Yeah, sure. So on the second, I'll take the second one first. So that thought that, once something is done, it's done. And there's no reason for us to hold on to things that have happened or to ruminate over them. We might, for instance, take great offense or upset at something that happened just the day beforehand, for instance. But if a similar event happened 10 years ago in our lives, we wouldn't still take great offense about that now. We would have comfortably moved on. So I think part of what Seneca is trying to say here is, well, even those very recent events that might be disturbing us in some way, if we can bracket those with events from a long time ago, then we can find it easier to let go of them and move on. And rather than focus our energies on those things that are now dead in the sense that they can't be changed, we can instead focus our attention on what really matters, which is the present moment, which is the only time that we've actually got, the only time in which we can act. So I think that's kind of part of what he's trying to say here. I mean, that last bit you've highlighted as well could almost come from Marcus Aurelius. His reflections on time, very, very similar in terms of what they're saying. I mean, in terms of the first passage, I think one of the things that's really interesting about what Seneca has to say about time is he seems to be saying two slightly conflicting things. On the one hand, he often reminds us of how little time we have, how quickly time passes, how brief human life can be, and how there are no guarantees for how much time we're going to have. None of us know how long we have. Time's limited, so don't waste it. He's constantly saying this. There's not much time that we all have. On the other hand, he also suggests that, in fact, all of us have all the time we need. It's just that most of us waste most of it on trivialities. And if we could just learn to stop wasting time on things that are inconsequential, and we focused all of our energies and our efforts on the things that really matter to us, then we'd find that we've got all the time that we need. And in his essay on the shortness of life, which elaborates on some of these passages that we're seeing from the letters here, he goes into this in much greater length. So as he says here, I'm the master of myself. I do not surrender myself to my affairs, but I loan myself to them. So although we might feel under all sorts of pressures from external sources making demands on our time, it's ultimately down to us which of those things we decide to focus our attention on, which we decide to give our time to. It's up to us if we want to get embroiled in current affairs and spend lots of time, watching the news and thinking about the news, or getting embroiled in things in social media or whatever it might be. But those are all ultimately our choices. And I mean, Seneca doesn't talk about this explicitly, but people have often done interviews with people at the end of their life, where, I mean, nurses have spoken with people who are really approaching death, and fascinating accounts where they ask people, what regrets do you have? What are the things you wish that you'd done? What are the things that you think were a waste of time? What would you have done differently? And it's really interesting to see the sorts of responses that people have to those sorts of questions when they suddenly are aware that they don't have any more time left. Most people say, I wish I hadn't taken work so seriously. I wish I spent more time with my family. And people will have different responses, but it brings into focus their priorities. And I suppose one of the lessons that Seneca wants to teach us is, don't have that epiphany on your deathbed, right? If you can reflect on death during the course of your life so that you can gain that perspective on what has most value right now, rather than waiting until it's too late, then you can gain that focus and prioritize the things that matter to you the most.
No, I think that's going to lead us very nicely into our next point. And I think Seneca's perspectives on death. So there's a couple of quotes here I would like to read out, and then there's quite a whole range of perspectives here, because you just touched on the value of time there, John, and an end of life reflection. But I think very interesting at the moment, again, using COVID-19, that people have had a big dislocation in their lives. In some cases, and in many cases, and for most of us, it's the biggest dislocation of normal activity any of us have ever had. And that has caused people to stand back. And those with some self-awareness, or whatever degree, have started to think a little bit differently about time. And I was looking at various, which I won't name, but I was looking at various people talking about their end of life journeys. And there was someone I was listening to recently, a very famous musician, and he was referencing, he's 65 years of age, and he was referencing that he can see the finish line at 65. He said, now I intend to reshape my life. COVID's had an effect. And he does, with a sense of sadness, that there were many years that this particular musician, who is very famous, felt like that although I achieved a lot, I did waste a lot of time. And now that I'm 65, and with the effect of COVID, and with different perspectives, he's going to utilize whatever time is left much differently because of the time he's had to reflect over the last month. And I would suspect that people on this webinar and across wider parts of society have had real moments to think about things because of the availability of time, or more challenging effects around potentially their employment, their careers, and different impacts, and therefore how they're concentrating, which does bring up this, which is sometimes in our society an uncomfortable subject, is death. But Seneca again references it a lot. He talks to it a lot in various letters, and reminding us to keep an eye on the finishing line, and therefore that it's a positive almost, because it will hopefully promote an individual's awareness of what stage in life and what season of life, if you will, you're in, and therefore what are you looking to accomplish, or how you're spending your time. So although it's something we often don't want to talk about, he uses it, I find, very positively to continually force the question back on an individual: how am I spending my time now? And what do I have left? And he also then, once he's almost continually thinking about it, this second quote resonates very powerfully to me. And it goes as follows: before I became old, I should say, it's a misquote, I tried to live well. Now that I'm old, I shall try to die well. But dying well means dying gladly. To have lived long enough depends neither upon our years nor upon our days, but upon our minds. I have lived long enough, and I've had my fill. I await death. So he's also challenging us there. How do we approach that part of life, depending how we're going to die? And no one can know that really, or hopefully you don't. But he really does spend a lot of time on death. And it does it to help you live better, but also to prepare for the inevitable. John, your take on his perspectives on death?
Yes. So, I mean, I think, of course, in general, at this point in history, people have been much more conscious of death on a day-to-day basis than we are now. We tend to sanitize it, to put it to one side. It's not something we like to talk about so much. I think it would have been much more obvious. I think we've talked about this before. Marcus Aurelius had multiple children, the over half of which died very, very young. So death was an ever-present experience for people. I think this idea of dying well, which means dying gladly, is a really interesting one. And around the time that Seneca's writing this, but a few decades later, Epictetus is teaching as well, the third great Roman Stoic philosopher, and he suggests thinking of life as a party or a carnival. It's an event. You've been incredibly fortunate to have been invited to it, and while you're there, you ought to enjoy it, and be conscious that it will come to an end. None of these things last forever. And so the attitude is one of gratitude that you got to come along at all, rather than bitterness or anger or resentment at the fact that the party didn't quite last as long as you were expecting. So I think that's a kind of an interesting thought. And what those analogies bring out as well is that if you think about a party or a carnival or something else like that, these are temporal events. And because they're limited temporal events, we have a clear sense that they have a beginning and they have an end and they have a limited duration. And we can kind of accept that, and we can see that that's how they operate. But we don't quite have that same perspective on our own lives, because of course we're not here beforehand and we're not here afterwards. So we don't really quite have that same sense of our own lives, even if we might be able to gain that perspective on other people's. So I think that's part of the kind of perspective that he wants us to be able to gain on this. Dying gladly, which I think ultimately means gratitude and appreciation for what one has been able to do, rather than regret for what one hasn't.
I think that ties into the third quote on the bottom here, where he says, "Men do not care how nobly they live, but only how long. Although it is within the reach of every man to live nobly, but within no man's power to live long." So again, he's continually challenging to use your time well, to have a higher plane of purpose above all that you do, or within all that you do, and in some ways to get on with it, to get on with it. And I love the fact of his continual challenge to use your time effectively, and be questioning what you're doing when you're doing it. And I loved your very, very strong sentiment there, John, where, as a businessman, at different types of in the last decade of having, or a bit longer actually, but different CEO responsibilities, these roles carry a lot of influence and a lot of responsibility, but for me at least, I found them very rewarding as well. But they are just that, roles. That's all they are. And I see a lot in the business world where people hang on to these roles very tightly. They don't, and it's the same in all fields, I guess, not just business, but in politics and in sports, different things. People hang on to these things very, very tightly, as if it's their own. And they're really not. They are just periods in life. If you're fortunate enough to have achieve some things that you wanted to achieve, or achieve a role that you wanted to enjoy or partake in, or that was your dream job, or whatever it is, they are just periods of life, and they come and go. And if you hang on too tight, that creates issues when they go away, I think. And those perspectives, again, Seneca is always, continually reminding us of, and again, his career was very reflective of that.
Yeah.
John, quickly, sorry, go on, please.
Yeah, no, I think that's really nicely made. I'm just going to add a couple of other quick comments on that passage in particular. I mean, one of them, of course, is the distinction between things that we can control and the things that we can't. So just to refer back to Epictetus again, we don't have any control over the length of life, so why pay that so much attention? Again, a lesson that Seneca's learned very hardly about things that he doesn't have control over. And the other is, which he comments in his essay on the shortness of life, is those people who complain about how long their life is and who hold on to it stubbornly are more often not the same people that waste most of the time they have anyway. Mm. And so if they just directed attention to the thing within their control about how they use their focus right now and how they spend right now, it would turn out that their life would probably be long enough to do all the things that matter to them most, regardless of what nature decides.
Yeah. And John, we live in a very busy society. We're at the cutting edge of the next stage of human evolution. Technology is ramping up so exponentially. All these things are happening at once. But in some ways, and if you reflect on that early Roman period, albeit with different technology, it was not dissimilar in some ways, right? It was a very ambitious period. There was a lot of wealth being created. There was a lot of expansion. And I think, again, Seneca, as he talks about life, value of time, right focus, he also has a pretty firm word about retirement and thinking you're all going to get it done in retirement and therefore you're going to fill it out before your death. Your perspectives on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so in a couple of his longer essays where he's describing society, I mean, this is obviously society. This is obviously the sort of upper echelons of Roman society, but nevertheless, he describes something that's all too familiar to us. He talks about people who are ambitious, who are greedy, who are concerned about their social reputation, who are quick to anger, who have, there's almost a sense in which he's describing many of the things that we might think are problems in our contemporary society, all of which were at play in the first century AD. And as you say, one of those is the individual who works really, really hard to amass as much money as possible, in the idea that once they retire, they'll then be able to do all of the things they want to do, on the presumption that, of course, they'll make it that long, right? I think we've all been very fortunate to live in the period that we do with such good healthcare, and many people, I think, just sort of take it for granted that, I mean, there was a time when people would hope that they would get to 70. I think a lot of people these days would be quite disappointed if they were to die at 70, and people would expect to get to 80 or even further. And that presumption that we've got all of this time in the future, it's just laid out and waiting for us, so we can defer certain things. This is something that was clearly a problem even back then in the first century, and Seneca warns people against it. Just as the past is this bucket that's now gone, equally the future is a very different type of bucket, which we hypothetically assume is going to be there for us. But of course, none of us know how much there will be. So instead, focus our attention on what we can do right now and what's most important for us right now, and how we can make a difference right now on the issues that matter to us the most.
I think you said something very powerful about death and the expectation of time and age and so forth. The Aurelius Foundation is quite curious about that part of life, and a very good friend of mine believes in the what they call escape velocity, which is the ability to outrun and extend human life through various means right out to the age of 250 and beyond. And there's lots of research around that, and we might be able to do something on that at some point. I'll end this particular point on that top quote then, John. And I really find this quote quite reassuring in some way, but also it shows me the pragmatism of Seneca again. And Aurelius, in his perspectives and writings on around what's at the end of life is to me quite similar. Where he says here, what is death? It is either the end or it's a process of change. I have no fear of ceasing to exist. It's the same as not having begun, which I think is a very pragmatic view of it. Nor do I shrink from the changing into another state, because I shall under no conditions be as cramped as I am now. Again, it comes to this, when he has language like that, it talks in a very pragmatic sense, very pragmatic, whether he's cramped because he's cramped in his human body, and you can read through the letters that at times he was not a very healthy man. He had his issues, or he's cramped because he was cramped in the court between emperor and other things. He uses such language that is very understandable and very relatable to. And again, I find him as the operator, if you will, on that basis.
That passage could have come straight out of Marcus Aurelius. There are very similar passages in Marcus. And just to pick up on your comment of pragmatism, the first of those options, it's either the end and I have no fear of existing. That's a very famous classic Epicurean argument.
Yeah.
And Seneca quotes from Epicurus a lot, and also from the Epicurean poet Lucretius. So Seneca's a kind of a philosophical pragmatist as well. If he finds useful advice and guidance from non-Stoic philosophers, he'll happily take that on board and use it if he thinks it's helpful. And that's a great example of him doing just that.
Yeah, it sure is. So we're almost out of time, John. We've only got a couple of minutes left. We're going to finish on these takeaways, but we do have a number of questions, but unfortunately we're only going to get to one. If the other questions, we might go back, we've got them, but we might just answer them through the foundation or on some of our social sites. We appreciate everyone sending them in, but we're very conscious of time and we want to be disciplined on that front. So the question I do have, John, is from Stoic Dan in Orlando, Florida. And it says, to understand Seneca's life better, can you comment on his religious nature? Did he believe in Providence or was he secular? Again, from Stoic Dan in Orlando.
Yeah, sure. So hi, Dan. Good to hear from you again. We go way back. So that's a really good question. Seneca's essay on Providence talks about Providence and talks about the gods in some detail. So that looks as if he, in that essay in particular, he is fairly committed to the idea of Providence. But I think if you're coming from a more secular perspective, I think there's a way in which you can read much of what Seneca has to say about the gods and Providence in a way that can fit with a more secular view. So, for instance, in that essay, he says, if you face great adversity, this is a test that has been sent by God. And the question is, will you live up to the test or not? But from a secular perspective, you could read that in a slightly different way. You could say, well, if you face adversity, why not approach it as if it's a test and see if you can deal with it rather than treat it as an adversity? So I think we can extract much of the advice that Seneca's saying if we want to think of it in more secular terms.
No, very good. And then finally, these are the takeaways that John and I, that we discussed from today's presentation from Seneca. I'll ask John to end the webinar in a moment. And I think that, the target audience that we've set the Aurelius Foundation up for is really a younger audience that may not have come across Stoicism, directly, and that whether they come across the foundation. And the thing that's very important for the foundation, but also I think is a more pragmatic way of looking at Stoic and philosophical life, is you come to these types of events that, or in this case, a webinar for the Aurelius Foundation, and we want people to practically take things away that they can actually put into their life, and then refer back to the voices of Seneca, Aurelius, Epictetus, various sources. And I think Seneca, again, in my mind, is, from my perspective, the great pragmatist. And his letters continually so focus on certain things. And these 5 takeaways are very pragmatic influences and learnings that anyone can practice into their lives on a daily basis. So, John, final comment to you as you talk through these very, very efficiently.
Yeah, sure. So we've talked about tranquility and cultivating that tranquil, calm mental state, which obviously benefits the quality of our lives, but also benefits the lives of those around us, because it means we're not going to be angry, irritable, jealous, and have all those other negative emotions. Stay focused on the things that matter most to us. And of course, if we are tranquil, if we're not being bounced in reaction to all sorts of other external influences, then we can achieve that focus and we can achieve the things that matter to us most. We've talked about knowledge and wisdom and philosophy. Keep learning. This is what everyone needs. Downtime. Everyone needs leisure. Everyone needs to switch off. And Seneca says, well, keep learning in your leisure time. This is the thing to do when you're having a rest from your regular work. And that's part of fulfilling what it means to be a human being, right? Humans are by nature curious. We all desire to know, as Aristotle famously said. So keep learning in your leisure time, he strongly recommends. Practice self-examination. So again, thinking about our emotional responses to different situations in order to help us cultivate tranquility, but also examining our values, right? So again, reflecting on what is that matters most to us and what we think is worth pursuing, and doing that regularly so that we can develop the right habits of thinking there. And then finally, don't take the time that we have for granted. Don't waste time on other people's priorities if they're not our priorities. Focus on the things that matter most. So I think all of these themes connect together really well. It gives you an integrated picture of what Seneca is suggesting we should do and how we ought to live our lives.
Very good. John, as always, thank you so much. An excellent overview on Seneca and terrific perspectives from all angles. On that note, we'll end it there. Any other questions, which there are a few, we'll come back and answer those through the foundation or on social. We look forward to the next event. We look forward to lockdown being sensibly ending and coming out in good fashion. The foundation is keen to get back out into live events, both here in London and the UK, but also through invitations around the world, which we're very keen to pursue over the next periods and spread the word of Stoicism and so forth. So Holly, thank you again for organising today. Thank you, John. And on behalf of the foundation founders and partners, we wish everyone good fortune until we see you all again. Thank you.